All right, welcome everyone. My name is Darren Douglas, so this talk is going to be No Excuses Postgres Security, and let's get started. So again, my name is Darren Douglas. I teach Postgres professionally. I've been working with Postgres since 2008. Primarily, I started with Postgres because I was working at a startup in the mining industry. We started to use Postgres in 2008, and I was the Linux guy on site. No one else really knew how to work with Linux installations or enterprise-sized Linux distributions. So because Postgres needed to run in that environment, I was the guy that had to figure out how to use Postgres. So since then, I've used it for a number of different applications, everything from SMS text marketing to data mining applications using Redshift, things like that. I've trained people from a lot of companies. And so if you'd like to talk about Postgres training, please talk to me afterwards. I'd be happy to do that. I have some stickers and pins that I don't want to take back home to Arizona with me, so feel free to take those after as well. So the point of this presentation is this. It's not about locking down Postgres completely, because that's going to be different based upon your use case, your data set, and things like that. Instead, the point of the presentation is that when we start at ground zero with a new cluster using the initdb command, we're in a place where this is not something we should deploy to production. Essentially, there's a number of doors that are wide open, so we're going to discuss what those are, and then we'll talk about how to just do the basics to get something to a point where we should feel good about using it. A lot of times also professionally, sometimes if we're really working and we have a lot to do, we could get a little bit lazy in our tester development environments and say, well, security is not important in those environments. But as we go through this presentation, you're going to see that everything we're doing here is so easy that we really should be doing this in test and development as well. All right? So the idea is we're not going to talk about how to turn your Postgres cluster into this big impregnable fortress. Instead, we're just going to talk about how not to leave the door wide open like it is when you run initdb. All right? So we'll start at the beginning. And I am, again, for the third time at scale, going to try to do everything live, which has worked for me so far. So, all right, so I have a Linux machine here with a couple of directories located here. So cluster A, cluster B, these are right now empty directories. Oops. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do just that. We're going to run initdb. So if you're not familiar with Postgres or some of the commands like initdb prepares a directory on the system to host a Postgres cluster. The terminology for Postgres, a Postgres cluster is one instance of Postgres. It's a cluster of databases. All right, so we're going to initialize this directory to be used for one instance of Postgres. When I issue that command, it's going to take this directory, put a bunch of initial configuration stuff inside it, and also give me my initial configuration files, change permissions, create subdirectories, and so on. So now if I take a look inside this directory, look inside cluster A, I have a bunch of stuff that has been created by the initdb command. Also, at this point, I can go ahead and start this cluster. So I'll go ahead and do that. Command for that is pgcontrol. So I'll start cluster A. And I get a message that says server started. So now I should just be able to do this. Type PSQL, and now I am logged into that cluster. What did you notice? No password. Didn't define the user. So a little bit about the behavior. By default, pSQL will attempt to log in as whichever system user I'm currently logged in as. I'm logged in as a Postgres user. So the Postgres user on an initial configuration is going to be my super user. So think about where we're at. By me just typing PSQL, because of this initdb command, I have logged into this cluster as a super user without password authentication. Not necessarily a good spot to be, right? So why was I able to do that? Let's take a look. At the beginning of initdb, this is the typical current status using initdb with most installation approaches. Number one, I'm in a situation where all local connections to this cluster are allowed unconditionally. All right. So that means that any connection from this host, this server, to the Postgres instance running on it are going to be allowed unconditionally, no password checks, just let the user write in. So we'll see where that's configured, and I'll show you what that looks like. The second thing is that the Postgres user, super user, I don't know what their password is at this point. So if I were to turn on password checking right now, which I'll demonstrate, Now I don't know how to get into the database, so we'll talk about that as well. But we could be kind of worried about this and think that this is a really insecure spot to be, but we also have to keep in mind at this point, with initdb at this point, there's no host external connections allowed. So this server is not talking to anything outside of that host at this point. All right, so that's where we're at this point. So let's go ahead and understand why I'm allowed to just type PSQL and it logs me right in. Let's take a look at a configuration file called pghp.conf. We talked about this a little bit in my tips, tricks, and gotchas talk yesterday, but this is the pghp.conf file, HBA standing for host-based authentication. So we could think about this as a file that defines our client connections that we will allow, how we will allow them, what authentication is required, and also connections that we will disallow. At this point, to read this file, essentially all of these lines are allowing local connections in different ways. The first one, where it says local, that's allowing a Linux Unix domain socket communication to any database, by any user. And then the last column, which is called the method, indicates what we're going to do. So if anybody makes a local connection, which is what you just saw me do, to any database as any user, trust. We're just going to let them right in. I don't ever want to see trust in production. And we really don't even have to see it in test or development. We have way better options. All right? The next thing, here's the IPv4 local connection, but notice in this case it's using network facilities. So it's addressing the local loopback address. Again, same thing we're doing. We're trusting it unconditionally. And the next line is the same thing, just in IPv6 notation. So let's just go ahead and fix that now since I'm there. So I'm going to take that trust. Oops. I'm going to change these all to MD5. We have other options for passwords, but that's how this cluster is configured at this point. To make that change take effect, I'm going to go ahead and reload my cluster. And now when I type PSQL, it asks me for a password. All right, so that's very simple, right? All we have to do is tell it to check for password. All right, can you guys see the bottom and the back? Exactly. I don't know the password yet. So let's talk about how to solve that issue. So I'm going to go right back. I'm going to temporarily allow myself to connect again. Reload the cluster. And now that I can log in, I'm going to go ahead and change my password. Just a few minutes ago, Gabrielle demonstrated changing a password or creating a user. Yesterday, there was another tutorial where we talked about creating users, creating passwords. So I could do this. I could say alter user Postgres password. All right. What does that do? That will actually alter the Postgres user and set the password to password. I might be wondering, is that password now in clear text somewhere in the database? No. Under the covers, it was encrypted when it was stored. However, there's a problem here. I can look at password history or command history, and if I type that in clear text and I have the read line library enabled, then you can just look at command history and you can see what password I set, right? Not necessarily a good thing. So
the password is encrypted or it's hashed?
It's hashed. Thank you. Yeah. All right. So I disabled trust authentication, but now I need to set my password. And there's a better way to set my password than typing alter user. I can just simply do this. And I'll open up a prompt, and I can set my password this way. So now, nowhere in my command history should the password show up, because I just used a simple built-in for pSQL. All right, again, simple stuff that I could do it this way, but why would I do it this way when I have a built-in facility that I can just simply type that in? All right. So now, like you said, we're in a spot where I've disabled trust authentication and I need to set my password. So let's go ahead and disable trust authentication again now that I know how to connect to this machine. I'll reload the cluster. And now when I'm prompted for password, it actually takes a password and I can log in using password as opposed to just leaving that trust door wide open, right? That's a little bit better. Now again, when we talked about having trust authentication set up with initDB as our initial way that we're going to connect to that cluster, we might think, you know, that's horrible, that's really awful. And really not necessarily. There are some installation approaches that have been made by some companies that have built wrappers or installers around Postgres or different distributions that will allow you to set that password at the time that you install. When we use our Linux distro-based installers, the generic installer we're going to have on Red Hat, the generic installer we're going to have on Ubuntu, is not going to allow us to do that. So we need to use initDB, and this is the way that we get into the cluster initially. Now, what I mentioned earlier is that initial spot where we're at when we have a new cluster done with initDB. It's not necessarily horrible because at this point, this cluster is not talking to the outside world. So I'm going to show you that setting that's in the PostgreSQL.conf file. All right, so let's assume that our machine was still trusting all local connections. This line right here indicates to me that this machine is also not communicating with the outside world. This is a setting called listen addresses. And what I found is in different classes when I'm teaching Postgres, this is one that is probably the most misunderstood. This is not about client activity. It's not about which clients we're going to allow to connect. It has nothing to do with the client. Instead, it's saying that of the interfaces connected to this host, which interfaces will we allow Postgres to listen to connections on? Essentially, it's saying which of the IPs that are attached to this host will we allow Postgres to use for communication. So let's say our machine had 3 IPs, and we wanted to use an IP of 10.10.10.1 for communication. Then we could put that IP right there where it says localhost, and then that would be the only IP that Postgres would listen to connections on. What you'll often see people do is they'll uncomment this line, and let's say that I only have one interface or I want to listen on all interfaces, I'll do that. By simply putting a star in that field, it says that any interface that Postgres can accept outside, or the host accepts outside connection on, can be used for Postgres. Production-wise, I typically want to limit it to the actual IP, but that's kind of an installation by installation decision. All right, so now I'm listening to the outside world, potentially. There's still some steps that I would need to accomplish to allow this machine to actually talk to another host, which we'll talk about in a little bit. All right, so the easy fixes we talked about so far. Number 1, we disabled trust authentication. We've closed that door. Number 2, we've set a password without allowing it to show up in our command history. But what about actually transmitting data? Now that I'm going to allow this machine to communicate with the outside world, how easy is it to enable SSL in Postgres? It's actually kind of trivial, and it's a really easy configuration. So I'm going to show you that real quick. So another configuration on my machine, I have previously created a few SSL, created some SSL, a cert and a key. All right, so obviously if we were doing this in production, we would generate those, we would have them signed by a certificate authority and so on. In this case, I just have a couple of self-signed certs that I generated, which can work. So there's a section in our PostgreSQL.conf file that allows me to set up SSL. Super simple, 3 settings to actually get data transmitted, data in transit protected with SSL. So the first is I turn SSL on, and then these 2 settings for SSL cert file and SSL key file. The names can be whatever I have those files actually named, but this is relative to the data directory. All right, so what I'm going to do in a moment is I'm going to move these files to my data directory, OPT cluster A at this point. And by simply defining the name of the file and turning SSL on, once I restart the cluster, this machine will actually communicate via SSL. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and make that change. And I'm going to copy those SSL files over. All right, so now you can see my cert and my key are located in my data directory, as I mentioned earlier. Can I get away with a reload here?
Depends on the version.
We're going to restart, just in case, so there's no more bugs. All right, so now I've restarted, my server started, everything's good. So now this machine is capable of communicating via SSL. One way I can prove that is by using the local host address to connect. And now you can see I have this additional line on my PSQL client. This says it's an SSL connection, tells me protocol and so on. All right, so just that 3 settings, putting the two files in the correct location, defining the names of the files, and saying SSL on, I'm able to allow clients that are capable of communicating via SSL to connect to my cluster. All right, pretty simple, right? So that's just the third easy fix that we can make. The next thing I can note is from a security standpoint, it's not just about making sure the right doors are locked and that I'm not leaving doors wide open. Another concept is just to really have an awareness of what's happening on my cluster. So the next thing I would want to know is who is connecting to my cluster? Who is connecting? How are they connecting? What are they doing? So let's take a look at that first question. Who is connecting? What I'll do is I will so on the right side of my screen, this is still the same machine. I'm just going to go ahead and tail the logs over here so we can watch the changes take place. Oops. All right, so I'm tailing logs over on that screen. What I'll do here is I'll actually make a change to my configuration again, another simple change that will allow me to know who is connecting. So there's a whole section in PostgreSQL.conf regarding logging. And what I'll do is I will turn on this setting for log connections. All right. So if I want to log connections, when connections are made to my system, and log when disconnections are made, then I'll just change this setting to on. All I have to do is reload the cluster for that. All right. You can see at the bottom of the log screen over here, that change was noted. Log connections was changed to on. And so now let's watch when I try to connect again. So you see the connection attempt was received. It indicates which host it was, which port. I'm going to actually mess up the password. And notice even there, it shows that a bad password attempt was made. All right. So password authentication failed for the specified user. It even shows which pgh.conf line was attempted to match, and so on. Let's successfully connect. This time it was a socket connection. So it says connection received using host local, connection authorized, database Postgres. Even if I create other databases, so yesterday I used the Baltimore database. If I connect to Baltimore, because our connections from the client standpoint in Postgres are made to a database, then it notes a disconnection from the Postgres database and a connection to the Baltimore database as I switch between databases. All right. So again, something pretty simple to know who is connecting to my system. What are they doing though? And this is one that we noted yesterday. From the standpoint of auditing and logging, how many of you have to essentially log every query issued against a database? Anybody needs to do that? Yeah, no, kinda, not really. Every slow one, yeah. Every slow one. Yeah, we did that. I'll actually demonstrate that now while we're here. But this setting for logging, so log min duration statement, by changing that to a 0, it will log all statements. So now I can see everything that is happening inside my database. Now, if for the performance standpoint, if I wanted to log slow queries and say my definition of a slow query is 1 second, and I just change that to the number of milliseconds, and anything that exceeds that will be logged. But what we're going to do is we're just going to change this to 0 so I can see all activity. We'll reload again. My connections are still being logged. My password authentication was logged. Connect to Baltimore. My disconnection and connection to the Baltimore database was logged. And now let's see if I can see what happens when I try to import some data. All the queries necessary to create the table and then to import data from that PG dump file that I just imported, as well as a problem with a role that doesn't exist, were all logged right at that point. So now I not only know who is connecting, but I also know what they're doing while they're connecting. One really simple thing we can do is just, there's a section that I find that people who are new to Postgres often overlook in the pghp.conf, or not pghp.conf, but postgresql.conf, is this section. So here in logging, here's log line prefix. So many times our logs are going to be consumed by other services. We may be sending logs to syslog, or we could just still be working with our plain text file logs on our server. In any of those cases, we can still customize what is attached to the prefix of each line before it goes out. So if for each message that shows up in the log, I want to know, say, which application or client it was, if I need to know which user it was, what the source IP of the client was, or any of those types of things, I can include it here. So at this point, our log line is not very rich. This is taken pretty literally. So %m will represent timestamp with milliseconds, then there will be a space, and then in square braces we will have %p, which is the process ID. That's useful, but it may not be what I need for my use case. So let's add some stuff to it. So I have a little sample line here. We can specify the username. I'm going to put an @ sign, and I'm going to have the remote host or IP. I'm going to put a space, I'm going to have the database name, and then I'm going to go ahead and leave that M and P as it had by default, right? So hopefully I should get a lot more rich information based on that. So I'll just go ahead and add those in. So in this case, %u, it's going to be an application, the username at their host ID, and the database name, and we'll use that.
Some of this based on syslogging.
So these logs can be sent to the syslog facility. But right now they're just going to a file in the data directory at this point. But in production you absolutely could route into syslog. All right, so I reload it. You can see it noted that my prefix was changed, and so let's try to connect. All right, so now I have all that information. This is the Postgres user. Let me move this up so you can see it in the back. At the local host connecting to the Postgres database. If I connect to Baltimore, this is now still the Postgres user at the local address connecting to the Baltimore database for the connection there. I describe tables. Again, that was the Postgres user at the local database, at the local host Baltimore database. All right. And we're going to add a few more things to that as we continue forward. So now I'm able to associate the activity or that log line with the user and possibly even their connection where they are coming from as they issue those queries. Here's another easy fix. Now that I have SSL enabled on the server side, I can force my clients to connect using SSL. There's 3 settings that essentially define our network type, our network connections in the Postgres, in the pghp.conf file. The first is host. Host is going to be any network connection. Typically we're going to prefer SSL based upon the client. All right, so host will allow me to connect with SSL or not. If I want to force SSL only, then I use the setting host SSL. And if for some reason I want to force no SSL, such as some client that's not capable, then I can force host SSL or specify that as an option only for one particular connection. Also, to demonstrate how we can log our different applications, I'm just going to go ahead and demo this with pgadmin. So, let's put all these pieces together and it should show us what's happening when we try to do this. So let me grab pgadmin. And I'm going to create a new server. I have an entry for demo 02 on my machine. Let me get my button back. Connection is demo 02. And I'm going to save it. All right, so this is one of the first. It's hard to see that error. I can't get pgadmin showing on my screen in a size that I can use and that you can see. But essentially the message says there's no hva.conf entry for host 12.157.195.98, which is apparently where we're at, for user Postgres database Postgres with SSL on. Second error it says is that there's no entry for that user SSL off. So that's the behavior of that host indicator at the beginning of a PG hva.conf line. When we say that we're going to allow either one, first attempt is going to be SSL on, second attempt is SSL off. Basically, this connection, the client is saying, I tried both ways, I can't connect. All right. So we can go ahead and modify that quickly. All right. So the main issue here is that I haven't allowed anything from this network to connect. So I'm going to now allow connections from the Pasadena Convention Center. So I'll include a line for that. And at the beginning of that line, I'm going to tell it to force SSL. So we'll reload. On my client, I'm going to select SSL disabled and see if I can connect. So what it tells me is no hva.conf entry for this IP address now, SSL off. If I require SSL on my client side, now my only issue is I'm not setting a password, which is pretty easy to fix. And I'm now able to connect to that demo server and see the databases that we've been working with, Baltimore and Postgres. Right. So it's that simple to tell to force our client connections to use SSL by just simply adding that one keyword at the beginning of the line. Right. Now, the last little comment I wanted to make, if we go all the way back to the beginning, you may have caught this, right? Enabling trust authentication from local connections, you can change this by editing pghva.conf, which is the approach we took, or by using the option -a off local auth host next time you run an ITDB. So the reason why I still went through all of this is that you can see that there's still a number of steps and things that we really want to be aware of to properly at least get something usable from a security standpoint. But we could take away 2 of those steps in our very first initdb command that we issued. So here's a sample of one where I could do an initdb on new cluster directory and specify ahead of time, let's go ahead and apply a password to the Postgres super user and require password authentication for connections. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that real quick. So initdb, directories opt cluster B -WA. And I could choose, all right, and so now before initdb even begins, it's going to say, okay, well, you obviously don't want me to leave this cluster wide open, so let's go ahead and prompt you for Postgres super user password. And now I'm in a spot that when I start that cluster, it will prompt me for password, unlike the other one that let me write in. But that does not mean that we still don't have to be aware of these other pieces, such as the listen addresses, if we want to talk to outside connections, such as the way to turn on SSL and the other simple fixes that we talked about so far. All right. I think that went faster than I expected. Go ahead.
So kind of off topic, but since I work with different types of databases, and I assume there's probably your best practices would apply to other databases like maybe MySQL. Just brief on this. Is that the case? Some of these may be specific to the database.
So are these best practice specific to the database, is the question?
I'm saying, yeah, these 8 could probably be applied to MySQL with some differences because they're
Yeah.
specific to Postgres.
Exactly. You could apply these general principles to any database. I've done some MySQL, so MySQL has the same concept of the listener, right? So yeah, instead of allowing the listener to be wide open to any interface, the listener could be specified to a particular address. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Good question. Yes?
I noticed the replication lines in the PHP comp file. Is there anything need to be done with those up? Because it also has trust and the local connection.
Yeah, good point. So let me just show that real quick. So the question is down here, we're also trusting replication connections, which no, I would not do that in production. I would absolutely change that to an actual real type of authentication for those connections as well. Especially since this type of replication definition that you see here, this is for streaming replication. So when we do logical replication, at least through version 11, it's a little bit different. We specify the database there. But for stream replication, we're allowing replication of essentially everything on this cluster. So yeah, I don't want to leave that open to trust. So good question. Yep. Yep.
When you talk about clusters, does that mean that it's by default creating secondary databases?
No, that's a good question. It's a very common one. In Postgres, the concept of a cluster is database cluster. So even though typically we think cluster, we're thinking multiple hosts or multiple machines or multiple identical databases. From the Postgres standpoint, we're talking about cluster databases. So the easiest analogy is think of one instance of Postgres. So when I say cluster, I'm talking about just essentially one Postgres instance, one Postgres server, you might say. Yep. Yep, good question. In the back?
If you're logging all queries, is it log thoroughly everything? So if you have clear text in there, or a key or password, will it log that in clear text?
Yep. Yep. And also, we talked about this last year, and Joe mentioned another way we could do it. If you invoke pSQL -a, let's say that from a development standpoint, I'm just giving you this as extra. From a development standpoint, let's say you just want to know what things are doing under the covers, or you just want to see some of the internal catalogs when you use some of the pSQL meta commands. If you launch pSQL with -a, then it's going to kick back to you all the queries. Minus E, yeah.
For echo.
Minus capital E, thanks.
A shows you the clear use.
But also something that you're going to see is, the reason why I mention that is that one way that I like to show people you can learn a lot about the internal tables and system catalogs is this. So, for instance, if I were to just do a quick command that'll require an autocomplete. So, try to connect to any database that starts with BAL, right? And I hit tab. Over here, I can see the internal catalogs that it hit to determine what databases could be auto-completed. And I'll tell you that just leaving that on for a day in a test environment, I learned a lot more about the catalogs than I ever learned just from documentation. Yes?
To layer your security, when you set up the Postgres system, do you also come back with IP tables, maybe SE Linux, do harden it?
Yeah, I don't do that. I know these guys do a lot of that. But yeah, I mean, there's all security should be layered, of course. This is just the basics of the Postgres level. There's also more advanced stuff that I do in a production environment than just this, which includes additional ways to encrypt connections through tunnels and stuff like that, so.
It's a long list.
Yeah. Yeah,
Thank you.
but this is just the basics so that we don't leave the door wide open in a production environment.
So in a self-signed cert, so it's not doing checking of the certificate?
Yeah,
What, do you know what part is checking, like just the date or just not the common name or
I don't know what parts it's not
You
checking.
don't check much,
not much?
but you can, on both the server and the client side, request more validation, right? So
Like verify full or?
verify full is what you would want to have, and you really, if you're doing it right, you want that on both the server and the client side.
Time and date.
That'll check expiration, that'll check the actual username matches the username that you're connecting as, the database name matches the database you're connected to.
Just check
all-
replication list.
It can be configured to check replication. You set a CRL in Postgres.com. And that you can reload now as of like 11 or 12. That you used to have to restart to get it to reload the CRL. That was fixed in, like I said, 12. I think it's, okay, maybe it's 12.
You set that up for OCSP, server training and whatnot.
You should also be able to set it up for OCSP. That requires a lot more in terms of how you set up the system itself, right? With OpenSSL on the actual box.
But
With logging on with this, wicked plug, when you use that /p built in, you just show the query and turn it after the MD5.
it's a /p built in.
You shouldn't use MD5.
Yeah, you
Think
should.
about it, by talking about the fact that so the actual, depends on the version and depends on whether you're using MD5 or Scram. But the hashed value will be seen on the server side.
Yeah, I'm just gonna demonstrate it really quickly. I think I just lost my connection. Perfect timing to lose
That's
connection
fine.
after I'm done. But it looks like
It'll log it.
it'll show the hash
Log it
string.
as an alter user with the password hash.
Yeah, I just lost my connection. Good. It's the right time to lose the connection once I'm all done.
Yeah, once you're done, yeah.
All right, well, thank you all. Appreciate it.